I'm going to do something a little bit different for today. I'm going to list my top 20 bands of all time. And I just kind of came up with these off the top of my head, the bands that have influenced me the most as a musician and as a lover of music. This is obviously just my list, so let me know in the comments what your favorite bands are. I'd be curious to know which bands have influenced you the most. And this is going to be in no particular order. I'm just going to kind of go through all of these and talk about them. And I'm going to list my favorite album from each of these bands as well. So let's get into it. First up is probably the most obvious one for me, and that's Dream Theater. Dream Theater is the band that got me into prog. When I discovered Dream Theater, it opened up my ears to the world of progressive music, and from there I went backwards and forward and kind of expanded my musical tastes out. Dream Theater was also the band that really solidified my decision to become a musician as a profession. I was really into guitar before that, but once I listened to Dream Theater, I was like, okay, yeah, this is what I got to do. And I really kind of buckled down and practiced even more, and then ended up going to music school and all that. So I really have Dream Theater to thank for that, which is great. I love Dream Theater. Although for me now, they're more of a nostalgia band. I haven't necessarily loved their new output since Octavarium, but especially since Black Clouds and Silver Linings. There's good songs here and there, but it doesn't quite hit me the same way. It's just probably because I'm getting older and all that, and so are the guys in Dream Theater. If I had to pick a favorite album from Dream Theater, I would probably say Scenes from a Memory. I know in my top 10 albums video that I put out, if you watch that, I picked Train of Thought. And that's because Train of Thought was the first Dream Theater album I listened to, so it was the one that was probably the most influential to me. But I think their best album is Scenes from a Memory. If I had to rank their albums, that's probably a video I'll have to do at some point. So Scenes from a Memory for Dream Theater as the favorite album. And Dream Theater is the first band on this list. As I said, this isn't in any particular order. It's just that Dream Theater was the first really influential band for me, so I had to put them first on this list. Next up, we've got Symphony X, and this should also not be a surprise to anyone who's watched this channel. I've done a bunch of videos on Symphony X. I've also done a bunch on Dream Theater too. You can check those out. Symphony X for me was the other band that I got into about the same time as Dream Theater. And they were sort of the other side of the coin for me as far as the progressive metal thing goes. They're still technical and intricate and all of that, but a little bit heavier and much more on the classical side of things, which I really love. I loved all the soundtrack influences, and you still had that proggy element, but it was a little bit heavier, a different kind of like really impressive guitar playing from Michael Romeo than from John Petrucci. But I absolutely love Symphony X. Russell Allen's probably my favorite metal vocalist of all time. I'm going to see them next week when they're in town, which I'm super excited about. It's been a couple years since I've seen them. But Symphony X is a band that's always been one of my very, very favorite bands. I take a lot of influence from them. There was a time back in like my senior year of high school when I first discovered these bands that I think Dream Theater and Symphony X probably made up like 85% of the music that I listened to that year. And so I think that's pretty obvious if you listen to my music, that's just kind of like baked into how I write and how I play, because I listen to so much of both of these bands. Symphony X is incredibly important to me as a musician. For my favorite album, I'm going to have to go with 5, the new Mythology Suite, or maybe it's V, I'm not sure. I think that's kind of the most probably the most progressive album of Symphony X. It has a lot of different influences, but it's also where they're starting to get heavier. You know, later on in the newer Symphony X albums, they're like completely just heavy, balls to the wall, and there isn't as much of the prog stuff in there, but this album has a really good blend of kind of both. It's a cool concept, has some really awesome songs in it, so that's my pick for favorite album. I think The Odyssey would be like a close second. I actually ranked all the Symphony X albums last year, I believe. You can check that out on my channel if you'd like, but there you go, Symphony X. Next up is another obvious one. I'm going to get these all out of the way right off the bat, and that is Rush. Of course, Rush is a massive influence for me. Once I discovered Dream Theater, I had to figure out where are they getting this stuff from, and that led me right to Rush, and I instantly fell in love with Rush. I love everything that Rush has done, even some of the 80s stuff, but especially the kind of classic era of Rush. I think my favorite Rush album has got to be Hemispheres. I really love how experimental and sort of over-the-top Hemispheres is. Of course, Moving Pictures and Permanent Waves are also amazing, and I love 2112, all that. But Hemispheres for me is the one. There's not really much I can say about Rush. It's Rush. Everyone knows who Rush is. And they kind of, for me, bridge that gap between prog rock and prog metal. They were kind of their own thing. They weren't part of the British, early prog scene. But they still had some of the those influences, but they also brought in a lot of hard rock influences and, of course, influenced a lot of my favorite progressive metal bands as well. I was able to see Rush in 2008 and 2010 before Neil passed and before they disbanded. I'm really glad I got a chance to see them while I could. It was a really kind of core memory for me as a musician. Absolutely love Rush, one of my favorite bands. Next on the list, we have Porcupine Tree, another really important band for me early on. I got into them a little bit after Dream Theater and Symphony X, but they kind of occupied the opposite side of prog. So you have the technical over-the-top playing side of prog, which is like the Dream Theater, Symphony X thing. And then on the other side, you have the more song-focused experimental side of prog, and that's what Porcupine Tree is. There's a lot of great playing in Porcupine Tree, especially from Gavin Harrison, but all of them are incredible musicians, right? But there's no real over-the-top kind of chop things, like show-off kind of moments, nothing crazy flashy. It's more about the songs, and Steven Wilson, at his core, is a songwriter, right? A very good songwriter. But there's also a lot of experimentation. There are interesting rhythms and interesting chords and long songs, a lot of things that you get from prog, but in a very different way. And so for me, it was a really nice change of pace from listening to a lot of Dream Theater to go and listen to Porcupine Tree. It was kind of on the other side of the spectrum of prog, more in that sort of Pink Floyd vein, which is really cool. My favorite Porcupine Tree album is probably In Absentia. I do love Dead Wing and Fear of a Blank Planet as well. And Anesthetized is probably one of my top 10 favorite songs of all time, and that's Porcupine Tree's best song, in my opinion. But I don't like Fear of a Blank Planet as much as I do In Absentia, so I'm going to have to go with that for my favorite Porcupine Tree album. Next up, we have Pain of Salvation, and Pain of Salvation was another really important band for me early on. These first 5 bands are really the big 5 for me when I first got into prog that influenced me, and then from there I kind of branched out further. But Pain of Salvation occupies a sort of interesting space. They're kind of between the really technical prog and then the more experimental songwriting side of prog. They have some pretty simple songs here and there. They're really beautiful, and there's a lot of experimentation and stuff, but they do still have those really technical moments occasionally. Pain of Salvation just has a very unique, original sound, and if you listen to them, you'll know that. So they're kind of hard to classify in that way. They have a pretty broad style of music that they do, and a very interesting way of just writing, and very influential for me. My favorite album's got to be Remedy Lane, especially the remixed version they did in like 2016, I believe. We can hear all the instruments a little bit better, but that album is just chock full of incredible songs. I really like The Perfect Element Part 1 as well, and then B was one that I really got into when I first listened to Pain of Salvation. It's maybe a little pretentious now, but there's some really, really interesting stuff on that, and it's kind of a big, sprawling epic. So I definitely recommend checking out Pain of Salvation if you haven't. So those first 5 were the most important for me early on in my musical career, but this next band was the next sort of step in my journey, and that's Between the Buried and Me. And when I first started listening to Between the Buried and Me, I could not stand harsh vocals. I never listened to any metal that had harsh vocals. I wanted only singing. I couldn't do all the metalcore. I just did not like it. But listening to Colors, the music was so interesting. Eventually, I started to enjoy the vocals, and then eventually I wanted more of that. And so it kind of opened up my whole world to the extreme side of metal. And there's so much interesting music in the world of extreme metal that I'm really glad that I was able to kind of open up my ears to that side of music. And I have Colors to thank for that, and Between the Buried and Me. Absolutely love everything Between the Buried and Me has done. I don't think they have a bad album. They have a very stellar catalog. Colors has got to be my favorite album, although I love Parallax 2 as well, and The Great Misdirect. So many good albums. And I've really loved all the singles they've put out for their new album. I'm excited to check that out. Actually, I think that drops the day that this video comes out on my channel. So I'll have already listened to it by the time you watch this video. Maybe I'll do a listening party or something like that. But next on this list was Between the Buried and Me. Next up is another one that should come as no surprise to anyone here, and that's Haken. Haken has been one of my favorite bands for the last 10 years, really, since I discovered them. I started listening to them right after they put out The Mountain, which I guess is maybe more like 12 years now. But that was such an incredible album. Definitely my favorite album of Haken's is The Mountain, although I've loved everything they've done. When I discovered that album, I was like, oh, like this is like Dream Theater, but it's got like a modern twist to it. And that was right at the time that I felt like Dream Theater was starting to get stale and I wasn't as into them. And so Haken kind of took over that spot for me. And I was like, okay, like this kind of music can still be interesting and still kind of pushing the genre forward and bringing in some newer influences. So they have the 8 strings, they have some of those heavy elements. There's a little bit of that polymetric, thing happening here and there that you hear in like djent, quote unquote, but done in this more old school prog metal fashion. And they've changed their sound a little bit over the years. They've definitely had some heavier albums. And I really loved Fauna, their latest album. I feel like they kind of honed in on what their sound is, because earlier on, maybe in their first couple of albums, it was more of a Dream Theater kind of clone sort of a thing. Not exactly. I never thought they sounded exactly like Dream Theater, but maybe more in that vein. Whereas now I think they really have their own sound, and I'm excited to hear whatever they come out with next, which I imagine will be pretty soon. So there's Haken, an obvious choice for this list. Next, we're going to go back in time a little bit and talk about Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd has always been my favorite of the older prog rock bands. I'm going to talk about a few other bands later on this list that fall in that early prog rock territory, but something about Pink Floyd has just always worked for me. And everything that Pink Floyd does is just so engaging. I remember listening to Dark Side of the Moon and just being like entranced by the sounds and all of that. And there's nothing crazy or technical. It doesn't have the time signatures. It doesn't have the over-the-top playing, but it has the experimentation. It has the unusual song structure and the unusual album structures and weird, interlude tracks that are just like, sounds and soundscapes and all that kind of stuff. And it just works incredibly well for me. I think my favorite Pink Floyd album has to be Wish You Were Here. That's maybe an unusual answer. Of course, I love Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall and Animals and all of that, but Wish You Were Here has always been the one that stuck with me. Shining You Crazy Diamond is my favorite Pink Floyd song. I just love the way that song builds and grows and just really takes its time to get places, which is something I could probably stand to do a little bit more in my own music. And I think that's something that prog musicians could probably stand to do just in general, is kind of take their time a little bit more, like building things, and listening to some Pink Floyd will help you do that. So Pink Floyd is a very obvious answer for this list. Next up is the Deer Hunter, and the Deer Hunter is a band I didn't get into until 2020. Had a lot of extra time on my hands in 2020 for obvious reasons, and I was listening to a bunch of new music, and the Deer Hunter is one that I should have checked out a long time ago, but I didn't. But I did in 2020, and I'm so glad that I did, because I absolutely fell in love with the Deer Hunter, and I just would walk around every day, take these long walks, and just play the acts over and over again. Act 4 and 5 are my favorites. Act 5 was the first one I listened to, so if I had to pick a favorite album, I'm going to pick Act 5. But 4 and 5 are neck and neck to me. The Acts are my favorite Deer Hunter albums, although I really love everything they've done, including their newer stuff. I'm always interested to hear what the Deer Hunter comes up with. I think Casey is such an incredible songwriter and storyteller, and the music just moves me in a certain way. And this is kind of a fun band, too, because it's also a band that my wife loves, too. She has a harder time with a lot of the really heavy stuff for obvious reasons. It's definitely harder to get into. But the Deer Hunter is just writing such interesting and good songs and really catchy that it's something I think almost anyone could enjoy. But it's a nice maybe, sort of step into the prog art rock sort of world. Yeah, I can't really say anything else about the Deer Hunter. Absolutely one of my favorites. Next up is another prog rock band, and one that I got into quite a while ago, and that's Transatlantic. Obviously, being a big Dream Theater fan, I wanted to listen to some of the spin-offs of Dream Theater. So I could listen to like Liquid Tension Experiment, which is like an honorable mention on this list. I'm not going to put it on there because it's like most of the members of Dream Theater. But another one I checked out was Transatlantic, which features Neil Morse. I have some history with Neil Morse. I went to audition for the Neil Morse band in Nashville in 2012. Obviously didn't get the spot. I made some videos about that a few years ago. So that was my introduction to Neil Morse, is listening to Transatlantic. And the first album I checked out was The Whirlwind. And that album just blew me away. I was like, wow, this is so interesting. Like, it had the, cool odd time signature stuff of Dream Theater and some really good playing, but it was definitely more on the rock side. It didn't have that metal edge. And I was like, wow, this is so cool. And the focus is really on good melodic ideas that kind of develop throughout the album, and really interesting vocal harmonies and all of that. One of my favorite prog rock bands, really, of all time, and I think one of the best prog rock supergroups. My favorite album of Transatlantic has to be Bridge Across Forever, although, as I mentioned, The Whirlwind was the first one I listened to, so that's a pretty close second. I think Bridge Across Forever is one of my favorite prog rock albums of all time. I think that's an absolute masterpiece. Absolutely love Transatlantic, one of my favorite bands. Next on this list is Leprous, and this is another band that's incredibly popular now, and I think for good reason. I got into Leprous quite a while ago. Bilateral is probably my favorite Leprous album, where they were a little bit more on the kind of, technical side, a little more on that sort of prog side, where they've kind of gone more in the vibey, vocal-focused direction now. But I really love all of their newer albums too. I can't really say anything bad about any Leprous. All Leprous is good. Einar has such an incredible voice, and the whole band is really tight and really good at what they do. But Leprous is just one of those really interesting bands. They have a very unique sound, and they definitely land more on the sort of songwriting side of things. I love the way they'll just repeat things over and over again, and they're really focused on having good hooks, which I think is highly underrated and underutilized in the world of prog. So an easy choice for this list is Leprous. Next is a pretty obvious pick for most prog metal fans, and that's Opeth. Opeth is another band that I didn't get into until later because I didn't really enjoy the death metal style of vocals. Although I think Mikkel has one of the greatest growls ever, especially on those early Opeth albums. Opeth has definitely kind of grown on me over the years as I've kind of come to enjoy just the songwriting side of things more, and kind of focus less on just like the technical elements of playing. Opeth is obviously a seminal progressive metal band. Blackwater Park is their most famous album for good reason. I think my personal favorite is Ghost Reveries, that combines all those heavy death metal elements with the lighter side of Opeth that they kind of leaned into later on. But even the softer Opeth albums I enjoy, not nearly as much as the more metal ones. I actually really enjoyed their latest album too. I thought it was really interesting and had some really cool experimental elements to it. But Opeth is an obvious choice for this list and one of my favorite bands. Next, we have Caligula's Horse, which is another band that I got into way later than I should have, but one that I've really fallen in love with over the last couple of years. Probably my personal favorite album is Rise Radiant, which is a weird choice, but that was the first one I listened to when I first discovered them in 2020. I really love In Contact as well, and I like Charcoal Grace as well. They're kind of in the same vein for me as Haken, but less of the circusy, noodly stuff and more focused on the songwriting. They bring a nice atmosphere to all of their music. Sam Vallon is one of my favorite prog guitarists. Incredible solos. In fact, I covered a few of them recently in my 10 solos in 10 days, if you want to check that out. And really interesting riff writing and chord progressions and all that. And Jim's voice is absolutely beautiful and adds a really nice ethereal sort of melodic quality to their music. One of my favorite bands and one that I definitely think you should check out if you haven't. Next up is Persephone. This is one of my favorite progressive death metal bands of all time. I discovered them in 2014. In 2013, they put out the album Spiritual Migration, which is my favorite album of theirs, and probably my favorite progressive death metal album of all time, or one of them. I think it's an absolute incredible album, although I've enjoyed all of their newer work as well. In fact, their last EP was really, really good. I'm excited to hear whatever they do next. But Persephone to me was kind of like, when I first listened to them, it was like death metal Symphony X. Where if Between the Buried and Me was death metal Dream Theater, this felt like death metal Symphony X. It had like a lot of classical influences in the playing. There's a lot of neoclassical guitar playing, a lot of sweep picking and all that kind of stuff, but done in this death metal fashion. They definitely have really dense music that jumps all over the place and can be pretty chaotic if you're not used to listening to this kind of thing, but it's a band that works incredibly well for me. Definitely one of my favorites. Next, we have prog rock giants Genesis. And I was originally going to put Yes on here, but I think in the last couple of years that Genesis has kind of eclipsed Yes as far as like my next favorite prog rock band past Pink Floyd. And Genesis just has such incredible music, especially early on in their career. Although I have a real soft spot for like Phil Collins poppy stuff too. So I even like the later Genesis albums, but something like Selling England by the Pound, that album is just absolutely incredible. But my personal favorite is actually Trick of the Tail, which is the first one that Phil Collins sang lead on. The song Ripples is one of my favorite songs of all time. In fact, I did a lesson on it very early on in this channel about the chords from that song. That song has just stuck with me since I was like, 17 years old. It's really, really important song to me. And that album is just so good. But all of this early Genesis stuff is really good. And, listening to it with a modern ear, it might sound pretty dated, because it does from a production side of things. But there's a lot of really, really good songs on these albums. And there's a lot of interesting experimentation. You kind of see where like a lot of your favorite prog bands later on got their influences by listening to bands like Genesis. So I definitely recommend that you go back and check some of these albums out if you haven't. Even if you're like a newer prog metal fan, which a lot of these people on my channel are, I still recommend you go check out some of these albums because there's so much here that's sort of the blueprint for what happens later on. And there's some absolutely incredible music on these albums. Next on this list is a band I've never talked about on this channel, and that's Nevermore. but I absolutely love Nevermore. They've been one of my favorite bands for a long time. I got into them at a time where I wanted like really heavy music, but I wasn't quite ready for the harsh vocals yet. And so Warrell Dane has this really interesting way of singing, where he's singing, but he's also has this unusual tone. It's kind of really harsh and stuff, but really unique. And that worked super well with Jeff Loomis's insane riffing, 7-string riffing and sweep picking and the insane solos and all of that. And so it was a real perfect blend for me, kind of like bridged my gap towards the heavier music. This Godless Endeavor has to be my favorite album of Nevermore's. I think that's an obvious choice. I think the title track on that album is an absolute metal masterpiece. If you haven't checked it out, you have to. One of my favorite bands, and one that I think doesn't get enough credit. Next, we're going to go to some thrashy death metal with Revocation. Revocation has been one of my favorite metal bands for a long time. Dave Davison has got to be in my top as far as like metal guitarists go, like just straight metal guitarists. I absolutely love thrash metal. I almost put Megadeth on this list because they were a massive influence for me early on, and I really love Metallica, all of your classic thrash bands. But I love the sort of really intense riffing of Revocation, and then of course the soloing. And then Dave Davison has some really interesting jazz influences too, which is so cool. You can totally hear that on a lot of the solos. Really interesting note choices and chords, but still done in this sort of death metal, thrash metal focus. Really energetic music and fun, even though it's metal. And they've gotten a little bit heavier over the years, but absolutely love Revocation. My favorite album, for me, it's got to be Chaos of Forms. I think that's because this first one I really got into, and it was like, super thrashy. I don't think it's their best album, but for me, it's probably my favorite. And there's Revocation. Next, we're going to put some jazz on this list with the Pat Metheny Group. Pat Metheny has been my favorite jazz guitarist for a very long time. Joe Pass is a very close second. But I just absolutely love the way that Metheny plays and writes. And the Pat Metheny Group, it's kind of dated sounding now, especially if you listen to those 80s albums with the keys and stuff. But there's so much interesting music in there, and there's really full of compositions, right? I think a lot of my problem with traditional jazz is that it's very much focused just on improvisation, right? It's like you play the head and then you improvise for a long time, and then you play the head again. And in a live context, that's really cool. But listening on an album, that isn't the most interesting to me. But what I really like about the Pat Metheny Group and a lot of the earlier fusion and stuff too is that there'd be actual compositions, right? If you listen to something like First Circle by the Pat Metheny Group, it really goes and takes you on a journey, right? There's all these really planned ideas and stuff, and there is the improvisation, there is all of that jazz stuff, but it's done in more of a composed fashion. I think that's what I really like about the Pat Metheny Group. My favorite album has to be Still Life Talking. Absolutely love that album, although Letters from Home is another great album as well. But the Pat Metheny Group is an obvious choice for me on this list because I want to include some jazz here because jazz has been a big influence for me, and Pat Metheny is the obvious person to choose for me as far as jazz goes. Next is Frost, one of my favorite prog rock bands, and another one I didn't discover until about 5 years ago when I listened to the album Million Town, and I was like, how have I not heard this album before? It's absolutely incredible. The title track Million Town is one of the best prog rock epics I think I've ever heard. And then last year they put out the album Life in the Wires, which is maybe just as good as Million Town, maybe even better in some ways. And I absolutely love that too, probably my favorite album from last year. There's a really strong focus on songs in Frost's music, but there's still a lot of that sort of noodly prog stuff too. What I really like is their melodic sense. Frost has really good melodies and ideas that they kind of bring throughout all their songs, motifs that come back and all of that. Very keyboard focused. There's a lot of interesting keyboard sounds and stuff there, maybe less guitar focused. So it's kind of cool to have a band like that on this list. So you can check out Frost, one of my favorite bands. For the last pick on this list, I have to choose an instrumental band. I think a lot of my favorite instrumental albums and stuff were from solo artists. So things like, Joe Satriani and Steve Vai, Guthrie Govan, Greg Howe, like some of my favorite guitarists have put out some of my favorite instrumental albums. Instrumental music is a big deal to me because I write mostly instrumental music now these days, and I've listened to a lot of it over the years. So for this list, as far as like choosing a band for instrumental music, I'm going to pick Animals as Leaders. Absolutely love Animals as Leaders. They don't really need much of an introduction. Tosin is an absolutely incredible guitarist, and Matt Garsked might be the best drummer in the world right now if I had to pick one. But what they do is so interesting and experimental. They're really pushing the boundaries of technique and interesting sounds, and also from a rhythmic perspective and all of that. And Animals as Leaders is interesting in that I don't always love the songs that much. Sometimes they feel like a vehicle for just exploring these crazy musical ideas, which is cool. But when they do hit on a good song, it's absolutely amazing. The Joy of Motion has to be my favorite album. And it's my favorite because I think it has the best songs. Things like Physical Education and The Woven Web, of course, with that thumping part. It's just such a good song too. I mean, it's not just that it has the cool thumping part, but that's actually a good song with good melodic ideas that really builds and flows well. So when Animals as Leaders hits, they hit really hard, and absolutely love listening to their music. There's always something I'm going what the heck is going on? So a pretty obvious choice for me as far as instrumental bands go, and the last one on this particular list. So there's my list of my top 20 bands of all time. That's probably subject to change. I might even change my mind, tomorrow after making this video. But those are the ones that popped into my head right away, and I wanted to kind of make this video while it was fresh in my mind. I'm curious about your favorite bands. Please let me know in the comments. You can list 10, 20, whatever. I don't really care. But I'd be curious to see what bands have really influenced you. And let me know if I should do my favorite solo artists or favorite guitarists. I think that might be an interesting video too, because sometimes that varies, compared to the bands, right? A lot of my favorite guitarists are just doing stuff on their own, or they might be in different bands that aren't my favorite bands, but I really love them as guitarists. So maybe that's an interesting video you might want to see. If you want to dive into the music of these bands, as well as many other bands, I've done tons of lessons on, I think, most of the bands I just listed, as well as many other artists. If you want to kind of get a feel for how they write their music, what kind of rhythms they use, kind of chords they use, how they're structuring their music, how they're building it, all of that. You can check out some of my lessons on this channel. This channel is really focused on trying to help people understand and write this style of music. But if you enjoyed this video, subscribe, hit the bell notification, like, comment, share, all of that, and I'll see you in the next video. Till then, stay proggy.